When setting up a Django project, one of the first thing you will do is set up your configuration in settings.py. And a very nice library you can use for this is python-decouple. So in this video, we'll quickly demo starting a Django project, install the library, and use it in your settings.py. So let's get started. As usually in my YouTube videos, you'll see me use this alias, which is just a convenience to make a virtual environment using Python 3.10, which at this time is the latest version. And in the same command, connecting two commands actually with the double ampersand, I also activate the virtual environment. So let's install Django and also python-decouple. That should give us the Django command, or not really. Let's activate again. I think that link should still be activated. Hence I'm doing AE, which is another alias to activate my virtual environment. So now we do have Django admin. I can do start project, my site, and I always specify a trailing dot. And the difference is that if I don't do that, it would make a my site nested directory. And I generally don't like that, because when I make an app, it now sits nicely at the same level, right? So I got my project with the meta files, the settings, the WSGI, and I got my blog app where the actual stuff happens. We're not going to do an app in this video though. I just want to focus on settings.py. So I'm going to use from decouple import config and CSV. And right off the bat, you see Django warning us about those security issues, security warnings, right? So the secret key should never be hard-coded in version control, and debug should never be true in production, right? So we need to make that configurable. And I think those three actually also show us some nice features. I'm just copying this in from our platform. So by default, config loads in secret underscore key from the environment, and we'll show you a bit how that works in a second. We can also specify default values, so debug by default, if it's not set, should be false. And we can cast it to a specific type, in this case a boolean. Now I've been using python.env as well, and I still use it a lot for simple non-Django projects. I found this actually pretty hard in that library relatively, and here it's a really nice interface. And lastly, to parse a list of hosts in this case, I can use CSV, which would cast it into a list of strings. So how can I set those variables? Well, there are two ways. I can export them. From my shell or from the virtual environment activate script. But usually in Django, I make a .env file. And I will show you the decouple source code, how one takes precedence over the other. This can be any string, but it should be kept secret, so not in version control. This is going to be true. And this is going to be a local host or a Heroku app, assuming I'm going to deploy it to Heroku, which we usually do. So we got a .env file, but here we can also have API keys later on. So this is private data, right? And when we make a new repository, this by default gets flagged to be included, and we don't want that, right? So right off the bat, I'm going to set my virtual environment and the env file in the git ignore, so that git will ignore those, right? That's important because again, the .env file can have sensitive data. What I will do though is provide the project with a template file. You can call this anything. This of course is now seen because the git ignore has this exact pattern ignored, right? And what I do in the template file, I just provide empty values. And the reason I'm doing that is that if another developer checks out this project, they know what variables to set. Of course, I can also do this in the README, but I kind of like this convention of providing a similarly named file, right? So let's see this in action by setting a little breakpoint here to see if those values successfully get set. And at this point, I should them all have loading in these different data. Secret key and debug is true. All right. So lastly, how does this actually work? So let me move the breakpoint up just before config gets called. And let's step into config and see where python-decouple gets the data from. All right. So of course, when we use the run server, the settings file gets loaded, and as the breakpoint is in the main module, at the main module scope, I directly get into this breakpoint, right? I can use S or step to step into the config function of the decouple module. It conveniently shows where it lives. So as it's a pip installable, it's in the side packages of my virtual environment. Here I can just go next, and I'm actually ending up at this return self config. So let's step into that. And here I got a hint. This looks good to me because a get means we're going to get probably an environment variable, right? So N and step again, and now I'm at the function or method rather that has the logic I'm interested in. And we see here that it first looks at the OS environment. So in Python, OS environment holds the environment variables set in the shell. So it first tries that, and then secondly, it's going to get it from the repository, and I will explain that in a bit, right? So here we're looking for a secret key. We can kind of test this out. The secret key is actually not in my global environment variables, so we should fall through to this elif. And self repository is a decouple repository env object, right? And that's probably going to be true because if the variable is not in my global OS environment, it's going to get it from .env. So let's actually confirm that this is the .env file being read in, and I can do a help on this object. And effectively a repository env instance from this class retrieves option keys from the .env files with fallback to OS environment. And that also explains why this equally works locally for me as well as on Heroku. Locally I have the .env file, but on Heroku the variables get set into the OS environment. So those take priority and will be popped off the stack, and Heroku doesn't even get to look at an env file. But locally for development, I prefer the env file because it has less side effects. All right. So I hope this little debugging helps in explaining how this library works. And you'll probably set a few more environment variables in this Django settings file. But with these three explained, it's probably enough for you to get running with python-decouple in Django. Hope this is helpful. See you in the next video.